a story is not a linear list of facts. That is
Right.
not a story. Saying A happened, then B happened, then C happened, then D happened. That is not a story. What is a story is taking us into the moment.
Today we have Eva Daniel, who is a public speaking coach and consultant. She helps CEOs and speakers develop and deliver compelling speeches. Eva, welcome.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me.
So, why do CEOs need help? What's wrong? Haven't they been doing this for a while?
Well, I mean, I think everyone needs help. We all need help becoming better communicators. But
Sure.
CEOs specifically, one thing that can happen is you can rise to this level of leadership within your company. And there's a lot of expectations put on you for how good of a presenter, how good of a public speaker you're going to be. But maybe you've never even received any training, or maybe it was back to you're trying to call back to that high school speech to class you took 20, 30 years ago, or maybe you
Right.
took one in college. And so everyone needs training, but especially those who are becoming forward facing for their company, whether just in front of their own staff, or maybe you are starting to speak out at industry events. But everyone needs it because clear communication is what sells our ideas, sells our businesses, sells our thought leadership. Maybe you actually have physical things you're selling, but communication is so important to building up your own credibility and your business.
Yeah, makes sense. And I guess, if you're just like an elite athlete, it's not like they're just going out there and doing their own thing. They have a coach, they have somebody who works with them to get even better, to take them even further. This is, a lot of these folks are people who, this is, like you said, is crucial. It's part of their main job to be a storyteller, be a communicator, and move people to action. So that makes a lot of sense. And before we get into some of the how you do that and sharing some of the ways that CEOs could do that, you have a really interesting story that we talked about. And you've been doing this for a little while, but you have a little bit of a journey for how you got here. So maybe we could start there. How did you get into this?
Absolutely. Well, so for the last 2 years, I have been running my own business, helping CEOs and speakers develop and deliver content. Before that, I was a speechwriter for Dave Ramsey and his team of speakers. Before that, I have a deep background, like 15 years in podcasting and radio. And then way, way back into the recesses of our past, I grew up in a family of entrepreneurs, making and selling wooden weapons at Renaissance festivals. So I kind of always had a little bit of that thread of entrepreneurial blood in my system. It just took several decades to come out and start my own thing. But so I have a deep background, 20 plus years of working with individuals, just helping them primarily on the content side of speaking and communication. There's a lot of attention put on delivery side, making that assumption that you have something to say, but not as much always on that, well, what are you trying to say? Have you layered in stories and humor? And do you have interesting points? And have you really fleshed out that content? So I always say that I'm a content first coach because I believe so much in the power of our content to really change the world. And so that's kind of a snapshot. I've done a lot of things over the years, worked on a lot of different projects and learned a ton along the way.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. You dropped a couple
There's
of
a
things
lot to unpack
that
there.
I just want to go back just briefly. And I chuckled when you said wooden toys and weapons because we had talked about this before.
Yes, we did. You and I had a whole conversation. I'm pretty sure that you own a wooden sword that I made that you purchased at a Renaissance festival, right?
So wherever my Ren Fair fans are at, I'm sure there's some people that have lived and died by the Ren Fair. I went to the Kansas City Renaissance Festival every year, and that's the one that you were at, right?
Yes, my parents made and sold wooden weapons for almost 50 years, and the Kansas City Renaissance Festival was their big one. And I always have to give the caveat because people always make the assumption when they hear that my parents were like real into Renaissance festivals or that I'm really into them because I mean, I'm sure you've been to them. You see people that these are the days they live for every single year. And so I always tell people it was a business for my parents. I mean, yes, they dressed up in costume, they sold the toys, but like anything else, they were entrepreneurs trying to carve their own way, make their own path. And that's the avenue where they saw that there was a market for it, a business for their skills and talents.
And they were carving literally and metaphorically.
Yeah, there you go.
They weren't geeking out about this stuff, but what was the entry point to that? Because that's a very unique niche. Did
Yeah.
you?
So my dad initially was selling wooden toys at a beach in California.
Okay.
And then he kind of discovered because, if you think about it, like Renaissance festivals kind of came around about 50 years ago, was kind of when they
Right.
started. And I'm pretty sure it was one of his buddies that told him, hey, there might be a market for you to sell your toys over here.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so that's what he started doing.
So, and you went to a bunch of these, and were you helping?
I
Were you a
went to a lot
salesperson?
of them. At one point, I calculated that I have spent over a year of my life in days at Renaissance festivals. I don't know what that says about me, but I did, even growing up, I feel like learned a lot about sales from my dad because
Right.
my dad is a masterful salesperson. And one of the tips I learned from my dad that I still apply in my own business now is that if you can get kind of like who is the ringleader, the decision maker, if you
Mm.
can get them to purchase, then everyone else that follows them will be interested as well, which I think is a pretty good principle. So in the
In this
cases,
case, it was my mom.
yeah, okay, I was going to say, yeah, there
So,
you go. You've got to know who holds the wallet, regardless of what you're selling.
yeah. So you learned a lot of those tenets you could bring into your life today. So that was, kind of mind blowing that you did that, and that's really interesting and unique. But then you also mentioned Dave Ramsey, which I think most of us know who that is. Do you have any anecdotes or stories or experiences you could share from that time?
Absolutely. Well, I loved working for Dave Ramsey. I learned so much about him. And anyone listening who's not familiar, he's a financial expert. He has a 3-hour daily talk show. He has this big program called Financial Peace University, helping people, get out of debt and save for the future. And
And I
so
know a
one
few people who
story.
who are going through the program too.
Yeah,
So
it's a great program.
yeah,
And I learned a lot working with Dave just about public speaking. And I always kind of recap a story, but it's one of the biggest lessons I learned from Dave. This was a few years ago. We had rewritten some portions of Financial Peace University. We were updating it mainly just with stats, with some new stories, but overall, this is literally content that Dave has been delivering for 30 years. And
yeah.
most of the updates we were doing, we're just staging, modernizing it a little bit,
Mm,
getting a couple of his new speakers into the curriculum. So as far as Dave's portions, there wasn't really like a lot of new content. I mean, this stuff he's
right.
been delivering. So it's 2 days before we're getting ready to refilm this product, and he stops by at my desk and he goes, "Hey Eva, I'm gonna need you to come down to the atrium, that was the practice area, to run through some of my content." So I go down thinking, oh, okay, we're gonna, he's probably gonna spend like 30 minutes just kind of going through those new pieces, and he proceeded to practice his content for 6 hours.
Oh
And
my
if
God.
one thing was like slightly off, or if he said something a little differently than how he wanted it, he would go back, he'd reset, he would do it again. If a word on the slide he didn't like the way it looked, he would, tweak it. If he didn't like the way that his pacing was, he would go at it again.
So is this
And
for he was going to be filming this, or he
he
was
was
going
going
to
to
give
be
this live
filming it.
presentation?
He was going to be filming it, but it was going to be live, flipped into video. And so he ran through this content in front of me and a few other people, and he was also taking feedback, getting input, and it made me realize what makes Dave Ramsey a great speaker is that he does the work, and he's
Yeah.
done the work over the years to really refine his skills and really become a great speaker. And I tell people this story all the time because I think a lot of times we can see a speaker, whether it's at a conference you're attending or on a big stage, or, maybe we watch this TED talk online that we find really inspiring, whatever the
Right.
scenario is, you can see someone that you think is an incredible speaker. And you can have this, a little bit of this mindset of, oh, they were just born with this skill set, or just their natural talent, or whatever you might say. And some of that might be true. Some people I do think have a little bit more dynamic presence on the stage naturally than others. But what I have seen, not only with Dave Ramsey, but a lot of other clients that I have worked with that command rates, $25,000 upward to deliver a keynote, they are doing the work.
They're
What you
doing the
see
work.
on the
Yeah.
stage is a small little sliver. And I think a lot of us, even if we think about speaking on a professional standpoint, not just like your Monday afternoon, presenting at work, but if we think about speaking on like a bigger stage, I don't think we recognize that speaking on the stage is a small sliver of the work that
Right.
goes into it. And if you want to be great at public speaking, it's just like any other skill. It takes reps,
Yeah.
it takes practice, and it takes doing the work.
Yeah. Got to practice like you play. I just always think about elite athletes that kind of similar. It's like the game is it's the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
Everything else, the preparation all year long for this one moment.
And so I always just like to encourage anyone,
Yeah.
if you want to become great at speaking, if you want to become great at anything, you've got to just put in the time and the
Yeah.
work.
And I can, it's funny because I was recently giving a presentation on, that was a public speech at a university that was on the topic of storytelling. And that's something that we teach some of our clients in terms of like how to create great content and use storytelling. And, I hadn't given one in a while. And there were moments where I had really rehearsed it and I'd really gone through it. And I got, just like you said, you find things as you go through it, like the Dave Ramsey example where you found this little moment where like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. Or that I really need to connect this idea to this idea. What's my bridge to get there? Whatever that is. And there were the moments where I clearly had rehearsed. And there were some moments where I was like, that could have put a little bit more of the work in there. So I can definitely relate to that. Makes a lot of sense. So I guess going from, not all of us are the Dave Ramseys of the world. Maybe not all of us probably would put the 6 hours in quite like to that extreme, but what could we do? What are some examples of how we could take our speech from good to great if we're an executive?
Yes. And most of us, it's a Monday afternoon or a Tuesday morning, and we're not presenting to hundreds of people or thousands of people.
Right.
Most of us are presenting something to 4 or 5 colleagues, 12
Sure.
colleagues, on a Tuesday morning. And so a few things that I recommend to everyone, and I know you and I share this common love of storytelling, is add more stories to your content. Stories are going to bring your content to life. They're going to make your content stick. If
Yeah.
you are in the kind of position where you naturally are sharing a lot more data, well, data tells stories too.
Right.
And so what are ways that you can integrate in some stories of into your content? I always encourage clients to, whenever you can, start with a story. Your first impression matters, even if it's for people that have heard you give presentations before, but make those first couple of minutes really count. Know where
Yeah.
you're going those first couple of minutes. The impromptu, off the cuff speaking, that's going to naturally come throughout your presentation, and that's actually a great thing. But you should really think through how you're opening it. You'd never want to open with, oh, well, thanks so much for having me, or when Mike asked me to give this update, I thought this or this or no. Like, I want you to dive right in with something interesting and compelling for your audience.
Yeah.
That's one thing. For those that are regularly on Zoom or on virtual presentations, I always tell people, if you're giving a presentation, stand if you can, because it's going to raise your energy
Yeah.
level. Also, if you're giving a virtual
Let me stand up here. Let
presentation,
me try that.
yeah, why don't you stand up to try it?
Okay.
And we'll see your fantastic shirt today. But
You know what? I'm going to adjust my camera in the future, and then I'll be able to stand up.
But
This time I'll sit.
standing raises the energy. Also, in those virtual presentations, consider moving your camera, whether that's on your computer, if you have a separate camera, 18 to 24 inches away from you, so that people can see your gestures. They always say that you want people to see your palms within the first few seconds of speaking.
Really?
Because
That's a new one.
data shows that people want to see your palms. So try to avoid the putting your hands in the pockets,
Yeah. We
grasping
don't want
your.
to do this.
Exactly. You don't want to
I think.
cross your arms. You want to have inviting body language. A lot of times, inviting body language, regardless if that's virtual or in person, is to just consciously drop your feet shoulder width apart, drop your shoulders, open up your arms, and smile. And work on making better eye contact. Hold eye contact longer. Your goal should be to hold one complete thought, one complete sentence with one person before you move on to the next person.
I love that. So that's
holding
in person.
eye contact longer. So that's in person. Obviously, those virtual presentations can be challenging because we are not getting that audience feedback as much. So if you're in a spot where you're regularly presenting to your team online, I encourage people, you want to have just more engagement. If there's a chat feature, asking questions throughout your presentations, looking for ways, what is something I can do every 3 to 5 minutes during my virtual presentation to engage the audience, have them drop something in the comments. I also tell those that are giving virtual presentations, can you get away without using a slide deck at all? And the reason I ask that is because we've all witnessed it. The presenters becomes a tiny little bubble, and essentially you're watching a slide deck for 15, 30, 45 minutes, and not your slide deck is the presentation. So that's just something to keep in mind. Sometimes you do need to have that deck, but if you are using a deck on your virtual presentation, do you need to use it the whole time? Can you turn it off part of it so that you can become more of the presentation? Okay. And then just, in person as well, I would also just say, don't underestimate the power of humor for your presentation. Bring a little levity. be excited about what you're talking
Are we
about.
talking
Your
about telling
enthusiasm is going to come
a knock
through.
knock joke?
I mean, if that's your style,
Okay.
if you're a dad joker, no, I always say humor is not the same as a joke. Joke
Okay.
can be humor, but humor is just a general sense of levity or lightness to your presentation. Oftentimes, this can just be a callback to something somebody maybe even said earlier. I encourage everyone to consider keeping a funny list or a humor list. And as funny things happen to you throughout the day, just jot a little bit of a note down. So
Yeah.
that way, later on, when you're building a presentation, you have something to look at instead of trying to like Google jokes, especially in an office setting. If you're regularly speaking to your company, what is funny at your company?
Right.
What is, culturally funny? Does everybody have the same challenge with the ice machine or the way the door opens or whatever the scenario is? Can you kind of use that communal cultural
Right.
humor that you already have that you reference?
Yeah.
But those are just a few tips. So body language, stories, humor, and then just bringing that energy, especially those virtual presentations, are just a handful of ideas I would give
Yeah.
everyone.
And I think on the humor side, some people, I think it's a little easier for others. They're just sort of, they have that as part of how they speak naturally. It'll come more natural. Stories with humor in them, like like you said, you have a humor list. I have a story list that I'll
Yeah.
use. Then I'll bring those in. And what are the five stories that you might want to pull from? Whether it's a story of success, but oftentimes a story of failure
Yeah, people
can
relate with those
relate to that.
vulnerable stories. And I would also just encourage every single person listening, you should be able to share the company story that you work with. Obviously, if you founded the company, you're going to have a deeper, more
Right.
motive. But even if you're just an employee, you should be able to share the company story and
Yeah.
you should be able to share your story within the company. Why do you work there? Why are you passionate about it? What's the story that brought you there? What are you passionate about the work that you're doing? You should be able to have that in a story that you could just kind of give at a drop of a hat,
Yeah.
whether that's at a networking event or if it does show up in a presentation. What are the filler words you're using? What are the filler gestures you're using? Sometimes we can have these distracting filler gestures that make their way in that are actually distracting from the core of our message. So get in the habit of recording yourself, watching it back, evaluating it as you would for a friend instead of, berating yourself like, oh, that was so terrible, or I wish I'd done this. Just looking at it objectively and saying, hey, what do I think that I did well in my speaking that I want to replicate in the future? What are some things that are maybe distracting or not the way that I want to be presenting that I can fix in the future?
Yeah. I know my wife is probably sick of hearing any of my presentations, but I think a lot of us that are really busy, especially executives, they're doing their speech planning, preparing, practicing after hours,
Yeah.
at night, early in the morning when they're not in the office. And for me, it's like, Ashley, mind if I do a little dry run and entertain this and get it can be a little bit hard to like get into that moment and put yourself there, especially with somebody
Well,
who
and I was gonna
isn't
say
the primary
spouses, I mean,
audience.
Matt, I'm sure your wife is incredible. Sometimes spouses don't give the best feedback
That's
because they
a good point.
either we've been married too long, not long enough, how
Yeah.
honest are we gonna be? And then we also can have your spouse, you can become too close to your content, but your
Mhm.
spouse and sometimes those closest to you, even those closest colleagues are too close to the content because they've heard you say it before, they were
That's a good
there, they
point.
knew what happened. So sometimes it can actually be the most helpful to run it by someone that's not even necessarily in your family, in your
Yeah.
industry.
Let's actually go back to storytelling. I think that's one of maybe the lower hanging fruits for people, that people sort of don't really always understand what that means. Like when I say storytelling, what it means, like we're talking about sharing an anecdote or an example, right?
I kind of like a scene from a story.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to say what a story is not. A story is not a linear list of facts. That is
Right.
not a story. Saying A happened, then B happened, then C happened, then D happened. That is not a story. What is a story is taking us into the moment. It was 2017 and I'm sitting at my desk, or last Friday, I had this moment when I thought. And so to start elevating things up where it's not just a linear list of facts that you're sharing, take us into that moment by when that experience happened. What did you think? What did you feel?
Mm.
What was going on with your five senses around you when that happened? Take us into that moment with you. And oftentimes we just need to start our stories deeper into the story. We give way too many details,
Right.
way too much context, way too much lead up to just get to like the interesting part of our story. And that's not to say you always want to start your story in the middle or like the catalyst moment, but it's often a good place to start. I mean, if you think of any of your favorite movies, almost all of them, especially any action movie, it's like we're in a car race and we don't know why, or, we're in the middle of this big thing. And then they backtrack and give just the pertinent details that led up to that moment. And you should approach that the same way when you're giving a story in a presentation.
And I think it helps too sometimes there's a lot of different structures of stories. And one of the structures I like to help people with, because sometimes it just helps them like, well, what are the questions that I need to answer in what order? And one of those structures, like a narrative structure, could be like, first of all, what's your headline?
If you look at any news article, again, it starts with something interesting. And to your point, it starts kind of answering questions in an order. So the structure you just gave is great, but don't bury the lead of your story, because if you have way too many details, way too much content, way too much setup, people don't even realize what it was you were trying to say.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, we think all this information is important to the story, but we're not thinking about our audience in that moment, right? And I think it's the same situation happens if you ever have anybody come into your office or into your space or your room at home, wherever, and they just start talking a mile a minute, and 30 seconds goes by, a minute goes by, and you're thinking to yourself, I have no idea what this person is talking about.
It sounds like my 5-year-old daughter. She has a lot of words.
Some of us don't, ever
we're
grow out
about
of that.
Elsa, Anna, like where are we going here?
What's the lead, right? And they didn't start with the headline. It's like the newspaper that you worked at, right? You guys got really good at writing headlines, because imagine you open a newspaper, which we don't really do as much as we used to but back in the day.
But it's called social media, and a lot of times too, right. If you're regularly posting on social media, make sure you've got a great hook, because that's what makes people to keep reading. Yeah.
Right. And that's going to grab people's attention. If you don't have those things, you'd have to read the entire thing or watch the entire thing to even find out what it's about. And that would be really frustrating. So that's a good, I think, thing to think about when you're coming up with what's your story, what's your headline, what's your hook.
And then another little tip like that, if you are speaking outside of your company, once during your presentation, drop your name in a simulated conversation, especially if you have kind of a harder to say thing, because that way it can unconsciously help have people envision coming up and having a conversation with you. So for me, that might sound like, people often ask me, Eva, what is the best way to do body language? And I tell them, la, la, la.
Yeah.
But consider dropping your name once during your presentation. So one, it clarifies how you say your name, especially if it's unique, and also so that they can envision afterwards coming up and talking with you as well.
I love that. All right, last question for you. I ask this question to everybody on the podcast, and usually the question is, what is one word or phrase we should stop using in the workplace? But I'm curious as to a word or phrase maybe we should stop using in our speeches or presentations. Anything come to mind?
So one thing that comes to mind is, I think. We overuse the words, I think.
Okay.
And a better alternative, I believe, I know, it can be kind of weak language. Now, if you really are speculating on something, I think is okay, but you should consider for more confident language, stripping that word out and saying, I believe, I know you can do this, and having that more confidence. Another one that can creep in a lot, and I'm really guilty of this, is, does that make sense?
Ooh,
does that make sense?
I say that.
Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
What's wrong with that?
We're looking for affirmation in others. People end sentences a lot on right, or does that make sense? Yep. Does that make sense? Instead, I want you to just end that phrase confidently and not be looking for that affirmation from people. Unless you are getting totally befuddled glances from everybody, people do seem extremely confused what you're trying to say. In general, those are just filler words, filler expressions that can be taken away from your vocabulary.
Right. That makes sense. That does make sense.
That does make sense. I'm glad. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. It does. I believe it does make sense. Okay, that's a good takeaway, because I think that I can hear it in my mind when I'm saying it. I can hear it in my mind when other people are saying it. So we're going to get that out of there. Get that out of the vernacular. Eva, this was awesome. I have some things I can work on now going into my presentations. I hope the executives watching this, or the marketing managers and executives that are working with the executives, the CEOs, can take this and help them. We do a lot of work with town halls and presentations across organizations, or even marketing presentations. So this is all fodder for them. Eva, where should people check you out if they want to learn more and get your help?
Well, I'm very active on LinkedIn, Eva Rose Daniel. I also at thespeakshop.com, I have a free resource called 12 Questions You Must Ask for a Killer Speech. Think of this as just being your content checklist after you've created some content to be able to run it through and ask some of these questions. Does my speech have a point? Have I used stories, humor? And if the answer to any of those questions is no, what you can do to fix it. So people can find me LinkedIn or at thespeakshop.com.
Awesome. And we'll hopefully be seeing you at the next Ren Festival in Kansas City.
Yes. Well, I mean, I don't know if I'll be there or not, but maybe we'll be there and have turkey drumsticks or something.
I would love that. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Eu fango.